There's a generation alive right now that built the internet you use every single day, raised the kids who dominate social media, survived multiple economic collapses, and yet somehow remains almost completely invisible in every cultural conversation happening today. And the fact that they don't care about being invisible is exactly what makes them the most psychologically fascinating generation of the last 100 years. Generation X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, exists in this strange cultural blind spot where everyone is so busy arguing about boomers and millennials and Gen Z that they forget an entire generation of people is quietly holding the world together without asking for a single ounce of credit. And if you've ever wondered why your Gen X coworker never panics during a crisis, why your Gen X parent seems emotionally bulletproof, why that one person in your office just handles everything without drama or fanfare or a LinkedIn post about their journey, this is the explanation, and it goes deeper than most people realize, because the psychology of Generation X was forged in a childhood that would be considered almost neglectful by today's standards, and yet it produced some of the most resilient, capable, and quietly brilliant adults walking the planet right now. To understand Gen X, you have to start with one image that defines their entire generation more than any cultural trend or political event ever could. A child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, walking home from school alone, pulling a key out from under their shirt, where it hangs on a string around their neck, unlocking the front door of an empty house, stepping inside, closing the door behind them, and standing there in complete silence knowing that no one will be home for hours. No parent waiting with a snack, no after-school program, no babysitter, no phone to call. No way for anyone in the world to check whether this child is safe, scared, hungry, or hurt. Just an empty house and the quiet understanding that you are on your own and you need to figure it out. This was not unusual for Gen X. This was Tuesday. By the early 1980s, millions of American children between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly unsupervised after school because both parents were working. Divorce rates were climbing, single-parent households were increasing, and the cultural attitude toward childhood was fundamentally different from what it is today. Nobody called it a crisis. Nobody wrote think pieces about it. It was just life. And Gen X adapted to it the way humans always adapt to things, by rewiring themselves internally to survive the environment they were placed in. And that rewiring changed everything about who they became as adults. When you spend your formative years coming home to an empty house, you don't just learn to make yourself a sandwich. You learn something much deeper and much more permanent. You learn that relying on others is a risk, that waiting for help is a luxury you might not be able to afford, and that the safest version of the world is one where you can handle everything yourself. That lesson gets carved into your nervous system, not as a philosophy you choose, but as an automatic response you can't turn off. And it follows Gen X everywhere, into their careers, their relationships, their parenting, their friendships, and their quiet refusal to make themselves vulnerable in public spaces, including and especially the internet. But the empty house was only the beginning. The emotional climate inside Gen X households added another layer to their psychological formation that most people never talk about. Discipline in the 70s and 80s operated on a completely different model than what we see today. There were no lengthy conversations about feelings. There were no negotiation-based parenting strategies. There were no timeouts designed to encourage emotional reflection. When a Gen X kid stepped out of line, the consequence was immediate, physical, and non-negotiable, and the underlying message was crystal clear. Actions have outcomes, and nobody is going to soften those outcomes for you. Now, whether that approach was right or wrong is a separate conversation, but what it did psychologically is measurable and significant. It created what behavioral researchers describe as a high contingency environment, meaning the connection between behavior and consequence was direct, fast, and consistent. Gen X brains learn to predict outcomes in real time, to assess risk before acting, to calculate the cost of every decision before making it. That's why Gen X adults often seem like they're thinking 3 moves ahead, because they are, and they've been doing it since they were children, not because someone taught them strategic thinking, but because their survival depended on reading situations accurately and acting accordingly before the consequences arrived. And then, on top of the empty houses and the immediate discipline, came the institutional betrayals that cemented Gen X's worldview into something that looks like cynicism from the outside, but is actually something far more nuanced and far more psychologically interesting. Gen X grew up watching the adults around them say one thing and do another, over and over and over again. They were told that marriage was sacred. And then they watched divorce rates explode through the 70s and 80s until nearly half the marriages in America were ending. They were told that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded, and then they watched their parents give 20 or 30 years to companies that laid them off without hesitation when the quarterly numbers dipped. They were told that institutions could be trusted, the government, the church, the military, the economy, and then they watched Watergate unfold on television. Watch the Iran-Contra scandal get swept under the rug. Watch the AIDS crisis get ignored and mishandled for years while people died. Watch savings and loan institutions collapse and take people's life savings with them. Every single promise that was supposed to hold the world together came apart right in front of Gen X's eyes during their most formative years, and the psychological impact of that cannot be overstated. What it produced was not simple pessimism. It was something psychologists have studied under the term defensive pessimism, a cognitive strategy where a person deliberately sets low expectations for future outcomes, not because they genuinely believe nothing good will happen, but because lowering expectations protects them emotionally from the disappointment they've been conditioned to expect. Gen X hopes for the best, but they plan for the worst. And they do it automatically without thinking about it, because their entire developmental history taught them that the rug can and will be pulled out from under you at any moment. And the only people who get destroyed by that are the ones who didn't see it coming. This is why Gen X seems emotionally guarded. This is why they don't get swept up in hype. This is why they tend to ask hard questions when everyone else is celebrating. They're not trying to ruin the moment. They're scanning for the trap. Because in their experience, there usually is one. And this psychological armor extends directly into one of the most defining characteristics of Generation X, their relationship with privacy and their instinctive resistance to the culture of oversharing that dominates modern life. A lot of younger people assume Gen X avoids social media because they don't understand technology, which is genuinely one of the most ironic misunderstandings in modern culture. Because Gen X literally built the technological infrastructure that makes social media possible. They were the generation that adopted personal computers in the 80s, that built the early internet in the 90s, that created the first online communities and forums and digital communication tools that eventually evolved into the platforms everyone uses today. Gen X doesn't avoid oversharing because they can't figure out Instagram. They avoid it because they grew up in a world where privacy was the default setting of human existence, where your embarrassing moments were witnessed by maybe 5 people who would eventually forget, where your mistakes didn't follow you forever in a searchable digital archive, where you could reinvent yourself every few years because there was no permanent public record of who you used to be. For Gen L, privacy isn't a preference, it's a survival instinct. A deep neurological conviction that the less the world knows about your vulnerabilities, the safer you are. And in a culture that increasingly rewards transparency and authenticity performed for an audience, Gen X's commitment to privacy can look like detachment or disengagement, but it's actually one of the healthiest psychological boundaries any generation has ever maintained. Then there's the humor, which might be the most misunderstood aspect of Gen X psychology. Gen X turned irony and sarcasm into an art form, and from the outside, it can look like they don't take anything seriously, like they're permanently amused by life in a detached, almost cold way. But that humor didn't come from a place of indifference. It came from a place of self-preservation. When you grow up during the Cold War, when your teachers are running nuclear attack drills and having you practice hiding under your desk as if a wooden desk could protect you from an atomic bomb, when the adults in your life are simultaneously telling you that the world might end at any moment and also that you shouldn't worry about it, your brain learns to hold two completely contradictory ideas at the same time without breaking down. And the tool that allows you to do that is humor. Irony became Gen X's emotional release valve, a way to acknowledge the absurdity of the world without being crushed by it. A way to say, I see how messed up this is, without having to fully feel how messed up this is. Laughing at something first means it can't fully hurt you. And Gen X learned that trick early and never stopped using it. Which is why their comedy tends to be dry, layered, self-deprecating, and delivered with a straight face that makes you wonder whether they're joking or dead serious. And the answer is usually both. Now let's talk about work, because Gen X's relationship with professional life is one of the most distinctive and least discussed aspects of their generation. Gen X developed a work ethic that was forged in environments that barely exist anymore. Paper routes at 5 in the morning, fast food jobs at 14, retail positions where a teenager was expected to handle money, manage customers, solve problems, and show up on time without anyone holding their hand. These weren't resume-building extracurriculars designed to impress college admissions officers. These were raw, unfiltered introductions to the adult world, and they taught Gen X something that no classroom ever could. That competence is the only currency that never devalues. So Gen X watched their parents pour decades of loyalty into corporations that discarded them without a second thought. So they never made the mistake of believing that any institution would take care of them. But instead of becoming lazy or disengaged, they redirected that energy inward. They became obsessively invested in their own skills, their own knowledge, their own ability to adapt and perform, because they understood intuitively that you can't control whether a company keeps you, but you can control whether you're the last person they'd want to lose. This created a generation of workers who are incredibly reliable, remarkably self-directed, and almost impossible to rattle. Not because they love corporate culture, but because they've decoupled their sense of professional worth from any external validation. They don't need a title to know they're good at what they do. They don't need public recognition to feel motivated. They just need to know privately, internally, that they can handle whatever comes next. And there's a paradox buried in all of this that reveals something really beautiful about Gen X psychology. Despite being the most fiercely independent generation in modern American history, they are also, quietly and without fanfare, one of the most loyal and generous generations when it comes to the people they actually care about. They won't ask for help. That's been hardwired out of them since childhood. But if you need help, they will show up without hesitation, without drama, without posting about it, without expecting anything in return. They'll fix your car at midnight, help you move on a Sunday, lend you money they can't really spare, sit with you through a crisis without checking their phone, and never once mention it afterward. This comes from the way Gen X formed bonds during childhood, not through organized playdates and structured social activities, but through unstructured, unsupervised time spent with other kids who were also figuring out life on their own. Those bonds were forged in necessity, in shared independence, in the mutual understanding that we're all kind of on our own here, so we might as well look out for each other. And those bonds tend to be deep, permanent, and expressed through action rather than words. Gen X doesn't tell you they care about you. They show you, and then they change the subject. Their relationship with authority is equally complex and equally rooted in their developmental history. Gen X respects competence with an almost religious intensity, but they have zero patience for authority that hasn't been earned through demonstrated ability. If you're their boss and you actually know what you're doing, they will follow you through fire without complaint. But if you're someone who got a fancy title through politics or connections and you can't actually perform, Gen X will see through you instantly, and they will never fully respect you, no matter how many credentials you wave around. This isn't rebelliousness for its own sake. It's a direct consequence of growing up, watching incompetent authority figures make terrible decisions that affected millions of people while facing zero accountability. Gen X learned early that titles and competence are two completely different things, and they never forgot that lesson. And now, in middle age, Gen X faces perhaps their most complicated psychological challenge yet, watching their own children grow up in a world that is almost unrecognizably different from the one they survived. Many Gen X parents consciously decided to give their kids the attention and presence they never had, to be there after school, to check in, to supervise, to protect. And in many ways, they succeeded. They raised children who feel more emotionally supported, more seen, more validated, but privately, quietly, in ways they rarely express out loud. Many Gen X parents wonder whether they've overcorrected, whether all that protection has made their children less resilient, less resourceful, less prepared for a world that doesn't always care about your feelings. Because deep down, Gen X knows something uncomfortable that most people don't want to hear. That struggle builds strength. That discomfort builds adaptability. That being alone with your thoughts and your problems and your fear without anyone rushing in to fix it for you is sometimes exactly what a person needs to become someone who can handle real life. They don't say this often because they know it sounds harsh, and they don't want to sound like the grumpy older generation complaining about kids these days. But they feel it, and it creates a quiet tension in their parenting that rarely gets discussed. The truth is, Generation X might be the last generation that truly knows what it means to be completely alone with yourself, to be bored without a screen, to be lost without GPS, to be wrong without Google, to be hurt without a therapist on speed dial, to sit in discomfort and just survive it because there was no other option. They are not better than other generations. They are not worse. They are simply different, shaped by a very specific and unrepeatable moment in history when the old world was dying and the new world hadn't been born yet. And someone had to stand in the gap and figure out how to keep moving forward without a map. They are the bridge generation, connecting the analog past to the digital future, connecting institutional trust to institutional skepticism, connecting the old rules to the new reality. And bridges, by their nature, don't get celebrated. Nobody takes a photo of the bridge. Nobody writes songs about the bridge. The bridge just holds the weight, handles the traffic, endures the weather, and stays standing year after year after year without complaint. And maybe that's the most Generation X thing of all. Not just surviving without recognition, but genuinely, honestly, deeply not needing it in the first place. Because the empty house taught them a long time ago that the only approval that matters is the kind you give yourself, quietly, privately, in a room where nobody is watching.